Posso começar? Bom, pessoal, boa tarde. É um prazer ter vocês aqui. Eu vou fazer minha apresentação em inglês para que o professor Paul Armstrong possa entender, né? Então, good afternoon. I am Luiza Larangeira. I am a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And it's a great, great pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Paul Armstrong to our third International Conference on Henry James and the first Symposium on the study of Realism and Modernism. This event is organized by Henry James Research Center. I would like to express our sincere thanks to the Department and Graduate Program in Literary Theory and Comparative Literature and the Brazilian Coordination for the Improvement of Higher Education Personnel, CAPES, and the Laboratory for Study of the Novel for their generous support. Paul Armstrong, Professor Emeritus at Brown University, is widely recognized as one of the most important contemporary literary theorists and a leading authority on the work of Henry James. His research focuses on the intersections of literature, consciousness, and interpretation. He has made significant contributions to the dialogue between German phenomenological philosophy and literary theory. And more recently, his work explores the connections between neuroscientific research on consciousness and cognition and literary theory of reading and narrative. His current project investigates how our species' embodied cognitive capacities enable writers and readers to communicate across historical distances. Professor Armstrong's distinguished career has been recognized with numerous honors, including William Riley Parker Prize and the 20th Century Literature Prize in Literary Criticism. His extensive body of work includes such landmarks publications as The Phenomenology of Henry James, The Challenge of Bewilderment, Understanding and Representation in James, Conrad, and Ford, Conflicting Readings, Variety and Validity in Interpretation, and Play and the Politics of Reading, The Social Uses of Modernist Form. He also edited two Norton critical editions of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and a Norton critical edition of E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. More recently, he has published the influential volumes How Literature Plays with the Brain, The Neuroscience of Reading, and Art and Stories in the Brain, The Neuroscience of Narrative. Today, he will present the lecture, Is There a Life After Death? Henry James and the Neuroscience of Literary Time Travel here. So thank you very much, Paul, and it's truly a pleasure and a privilege to have you here.
Thank you, Luiza, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to thank you and Natasha and Marcello for inviting me to this conference. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And I wish to congratulate you also on your very interesting series of conferences on Henry James in Brazil. It's a privilege and an honor to be participating in the creation of the Henry James community here in Brazil. Is the level all right? Can you hear me? All right, good. Before I begin, I should mention why I have a bandage on my forehead, in case people are wondering out in YouTube universe. The one thing that is similar between Sao Paulo and Providence, Rhode Island, is that the sidewalks are in bad repair. And I discovered this yesterday in a moment of inattention when I fell and hit my head. And Luiza and Jaume were heroic in helping me find my way through to an emergency room and experience the wonders of the Brazilian healthcare system. I'm all right. I had a tomography to see if my brain is all right. I thought I was going to be talking about the brain, not that my brain was going to be scanned in Brazil. but why not? But in any case, it's really a privilege to be here, and I'm very glad to be able to talk to you today about the project I'm currently working on in relating it to Henry James. The title, as Luiza said, is There a Life After Death? Henry James and the Neuroscience of Literary Time Travel. Oops. There we go. Our brains and our bodies are mortal, but somehow the cognitive processes they support make it possible for literary works to speak across historical distance, longer than the lifespan of any human being. How can this be? The dead seem to live again when we read a poem, a novel, or a play, and feel the strange but intimate presence of other subjectivities inhabiting our consciousness and our bodies. An author may be long dead, and yet their consciousness can seem even more accessible to and present to me through their works than the minds of my friends and loved ones. The power of acts of fictional meaning-making to cross historical distance may seem mysterious, even mystical, but it is an undeniable phenomenon testified to by generations of readers, and so it must have a material basis in our neurobiological equipment for making sense of the world. How our embodied mortal consciousness can reach across historical distance is also a paradox that fascinated Henry James. It is an issue that he takes up near the end of his life in his 1910 essay, Is There a Life After Death?, that concludes with the resounding declaration, "No, no, no, I reach beyond the laboratory brain." This unequivocal rejection of neural reductionism would seem to be an unambiguous warning against employing the concepts of neuroscience to analyze his understanding of consciousness. James's skepticism about the laboratory brain is shared, however, by much contemporary neuroscience that rejects the notion that a brain in a vat, detached from its embodied engagement with the social world, could duplicate the experience of what it is like to be conscious. Further, and perhaps more surprising, James's own understanding of how consciousness works, including especially his appreciation of its ability to cross temporal horizons and to support collaborative interactions, is consistent with and can be elucidated through theories of embodied cognition from contemporary neuroscience. These theories help to explain how, in his view, cognitive time travel is possible, how a sense of the past can haunt the present, how we can revisit history and imagine the future, and how, perhaps most of all, works of art and literature can speak across historical distance. If it is possible to reach beyond the laboratory brain in James's view, that is not because the mind is somehow separate from the body in all of its finite mortal particularity. The first half of Is There a Life After Death is unflinching in its acceptance of the grim fact, in James's words, that science takes no account of the soul, and that, as however nobly thinking and feeling creatures, we are abjectly and inveterately shut up in our material organs, end quote. The paradox, however, as he then suggests, is that the characteristics of consciousness themselves are not merely evidence of our finitude, but also provide means for transcending it. And I quote, "What had happened, in short, was that all the while I'd been practically, though however dimly, trying to take the measure of my consciousness on this appropriate and prescribed basis of its being so finite, I had learned, as I may say, to live in it more, and with a consequence of thereby not a little undermining the conclusion most unfavorable to it. I had doubtless taken thus to increase living in it by reaction against so grossly finite a world, for it at least contained the world and could handle and criticize it, could play with it and deride it. It had that superiority, which meant all the while such successful living that the abode itself grew more and more interesting to me, and with this beautiful sign of its character, that the more and the more one asked of it, the more and the more it appeared to give." So accepting the fact that we're shut up in our material organs, James takes the measure of his consciousness and in the process discovers that conscious experience has within it the possibility of undermining the conclusion that the abject actual is the end-all and the be-all. How can this be? This is one of James's most elusive and indirect pieces of writing as he contemplates the contradictions of our bodily, constrained, but potentially expansive condition. The turning point from lamenting the deficiencies of consciousness on the prescribed basis of its being so finite to celebrating its beautiful powers is his recognition that the capacity for negation, to say no, 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 that is immanent to consciousness, allows it to reach beyond itself. Consciousness is not identical with its objects, the grossly finite world, but it nevertheless contains the world, and this doubleness, it both is and is not the world, generates possibilities of negation and transcendence, the ability of consciousness to handle, criticize, deride, and play with the world, acts that go beyond the limits of the abject actual and that can be productive and creative. Our mortal consciousness thereby becomes the vehicle for transcending our bounded finite condition, not by leaving the abode of our experience of the world, but by making it more and more interesting through to and fro interactions whereby consciousness doubles itself. The more he asks of it, the more it gives in return. This to and fro doubling within consciousness makes it possible for consciousness to extend beyond its boundaries, giving it the power, in James's words, to establish speculative and imaginative connections. And when once such a mental relation to the question as that begins to hover and settle, who shall say over what fields of experience, past and current, and what immensities of perception and yearning, it shall not spread the protection of its wings. The paradox that capacities immanent to embodied cognition enable consciousness to reach beyond its horizons is also of central interest to contemporary neuroscience. It is a basic principle of neuroscience that the brain is not a mirror that passively reflects the outside world. Rather, the brain knows the world by projecting and revising patterns that organize the signals generated by various perceptual organs. These patterns contain the world, to echo James's words, as far as consciousness is concerned. Cognitive scientists like Lawrence Barsalou consequently describe consciousness as a simulation, an as-if model of the world that configures experience into patterns that become embedded in our bodies and our brains through habits that bear traces of past experiences. Consciousness constructs simulations of the world by reactivating the neuronal and physiological traces from previous cognitive acts in response to new situations that are like, but also in some respects, of course, unlike, the earlier cognitive patterns whose bodily cortical residues they reanimate, repurpose, and redeploy. The power of negation to innovate and improvise, again, recalling James, to handle, criticize, play, and deride, is at work here in the difference between the like and the unlike, through which a simulation adjusts past patterns to fit novel, not quite identical circumstances. Doubling the like and the unlike, a cognitive simulation is an as relation, seeing X as Y, that reaches from the past to the future. According to the predictive processing model of cognition developed by Carl Friston, simulations are cognitively useful tools because they provide models for testing hypotheses about what lies beyond our immediate horizons. Rather than attempting to represent the world in all of its complexity, which would be inefficient, if not impossible, consciousness instead responds primarily to disturbances and anomalies, error signals that do not fit what its hypotheses lead us to expect. Consciousness is the way we feel the push and pull of the world, registering whether things are going well or not, depending on how successfully our cognitive models organize sensory inputs into predictable patterns. The goal, in Friston's terms, is to minimize prediction error. Consciousness is always ahead of itself, in other words, anticipating that future experiences will take particular shapes, and it reacts when this does not happen. This negativity is then a prompt to consciousness to reorganize itself, to combat entropy, the tendency of things to fall apart or for order to give way to disorder, by rebinding the energy unleashed by these disturbances and revising its model of the world. The capacity for negation is crucial here. Hypotheses are not what they predict, and a simulation is an as-if projection of the world. A model is not what it models. This capacity for negation allows for reorganization, revision, and improvisation, the doubling and transcendence of James's criticism and play. Anomalies, disturbances that do not fit the model's predictions, prompt experimentation, as if hypothesis testing, with revised models that assimilate the error signals into new patterns of organization. This process is temporally horizontal, looking beyond the boundaries of the present moment and the limits of the perceptual situation, and a predictive brain is in this sense a cognitive time travel device, perpetually crossing back and forth across the horizons, joining past experience and future expectations. None of this is possible for a laboratory brain. The patterns that the brain generates to adjust its models to perturbations in sensory inputs are brain-body-world interactions that laboratory conditions cannot fully reproduce. In neurophenomenologist Evan Thompson's words, as conscious subjects, we are not brains in cranial vats. We are neurally enlivened beings in the world. Our cognitive models arise from corporeal, intersubjective experiences and project expectations about the patterns that future experiences will take that we test by acting in the world. A bodily, social, historical being in the world is not a laboratory brain in a vat. Hence the theory of so-called 4E cognition, that consciousness should be understood, count the E's, as embodied, enactive, embedded, and extended. As neurophilosopher Alvin Noé argues, we're constantly testing our cognitive hypotheses by acting in the world, moving around and experimenting with how changes in sensory inputs affect our cognitive models. As he explains, all perception is like touch, even vision. As in touch, the content of visual experience is not given all at once. We gain content, Noé says, by looking around, just as we gain tactile content by moving our hands, end quote. Hence, Mark Solm's description of cognition as an ongoing process of hypothesis testing that links perception and action in a perpetual recursive loop. We keep improving our generative model of the world by trial and error, Solm says. The more your hypotheses are confirmed, the more confident you are, and the less aroused, less conscious you need to be. As Solms explains, thinking is virtual action, the capacity to try things out in the imagination, which, for obvious biological reasons, saves lives. The instruments that extend the capacities of the mind beyond the confines of the skull are crucial to this experimentation. In cognitive scientist Andy Clark's striking phrase, the reciprocal connections between the brain and these cognitive prostheses supersize the mind. The narratives that circulate in our social world, for example, are an obvious source of patterns through which we figure the world. Although William James criticized his brother for writing novels without much action, and contrary to the assumption that his characters have large heads and little or no bodies, Henry James typically depicts consciousness as inactive, embodied, and embedded in the social world. For example, his famous account in The Ambassadors of Lambert Struthers' model Lambert Struthers' ramble in the French countryside, mediated by a Lambinet painting, is a prolonged exploration of the simulative powers of the extended mind. Struther begins his outing under the impulse of experiencing directly and immediately French ruralism, I'm quoting James, with its cool special green, into which he'd hitherto looked only through the little oblong window of the picture frame. It had been as yet, for the most part, but a land of fancy for him, end quote. But as he proceeds, the role of the Lambanet painting as a cognitive simulation, guiding his attention, a model providing hypotheses to test, becomes increasingly prominent, dramatizing how cognitive instruments can extend the mind out into the world. He could but thrill a little at the chance of seeing something somewhere that would remind him of a certain small Lambanet that had charmed him long years before at a Boston dealer's, and that he had quite absurdly never forgotten. The little Lambanet abode with him as the picture he would have bought. The oblong gilt frame disposed its enclosing lines, the poplars and willows, the reeds and river, a river of which he didn't know and didn't want to know the name, fell into a composition full of felicity within them. The sky was silver and turquoise and varnished. The village on the left was white, and the church on the right was gray. It was all there, in short. It was what he wanted. It was Tremont Street. It was France. It was Lambanet. Moreover, he was freely walking about in it. He did this last for an hour to his heart's content, making for the shady, woody horizon, and boring so deep into his impression and his idleness that he might fairly have got through them again and reached the maroon-colored wall of the Boston Gallery where he originally saw the painting. The painting is a mental time travel device that links past, present, and future, thereby illustrating Strethers' experience to, quote, that it was the way of 9/10 of his current impressions to act as recalls of things imagined. The painting is a useful cognitive prosthesis, an instrument that links his mind to the world because it connects up with what neuroscientists call the default mode network, an ensemble of brain regions for remembering the past and imagining the future that activate when the brain is at rest and our minds wander, what psychologist Thomas Suddendorf calls a general faculty of mental time travel that allows us not only to go back in time, but also to foresee, plan, and shape virtually any specific future event. As neuroscientist Daniel Schachter points out, imagining the future depends on much the same neural machinery that is needed for remembering the past. This is because, as Mark Solms explains, memories are not mere records of the past. Biologically speaking, they are about the past, but they are for the future. They are, all of them, in their essence, predictions aimed at meeting our needs. The Lambanet painting allows Strether to make these temporal connections between his remembered past and his expectations for his afternoon jaunt by providing an as-if simulation that he tests over the course of his rambles. He really continued in the picture, James writes, all the rest of this rambling day, and had meanwhile not once overstepped the oblong gilt frame. The frame had drawn itself out for him as much as you please, but that was just his luck, end quote. As a predictive model, the painting projects relations, X as Y, that prefigure what he will experience and provide patterns into which to configure the perceptual signals his exploratory activity generates. The absences in a simulation, how it is not identical with what it predicts, are productive because they allow these adjustments. An as-if model has gaps and indeterminacies that allow the coexistence of actualities which would be mutually exclusive in the material world. The past of Tremont Street, the present of the afternoon, the generality of France that his experience symbolizes to him. Memory and imagination connect in a virtual dimension of experimentation and reflection, a virtuality that James renders by repeating conditional verb tenses, what would, might, or could be the case. He might stretch himself and hear the poplars rustle, for example, or the driver would sit on the shafts, tell him what the French people were thinking, and remind him, as indeed the whole episode would incidentally do, of Maupassant, a literary model further extending and complementing the Lambanet, demonstrating how art makes life, in James's famous phrase, for the extended mind. These conditional tenses are appropriate renderings of the actions of Strother's mind because they suggest the virtuality of his hypothesis testing as he connects memory and imagination. As he walks and explores, the models he invokes, test his current perceptions against his memories and what they had prompted him to imagine. The tenses of time can cross and interact in this conditional space because predictive simulations of how the future might and would be join the as of perception and the as-if of imagination. What matters for Strother are not the objective materialities of the scene, but rather the actions of memory, perception, and imagination that the scene affords, a concept introduced by ecological theorist of perception James Gibson. According to Gibson, we perceive a scene not by registering the properties of objects, but by responding to its affordances, that is, to the possibilities for action that it offers, which will vary according to the cognitive equipment of the organism and its needs. Affordances allow improvisatory responses. A chair, for example, affords sitting, but it can also be used as a weapon in a bar brawl or as a prop for a handstand in a circus act. Affordances are defined by the relation between constraint and potentiality. Not every action can be performed with an instrument like a chair, but the uses that an imaginative agent might make of it are not predictable, or entirely prescribed. Strother's recollection of the Lambanet painting structures his perception of the scene's affordances as he interacts with the potentialities his memory and imagination open up. Such were the liberties with which his fancy played after he had turned off to the hillside that did truly and really, as well as most amiably, await him beneath the poplars. The hillside that made him feel, for a murmurous couple of hours, how happy had been his thought. He had the sense of success, of a finer harmony in things, nothing but what had turned out as yet according to his plan. How the Lambanet opens possibilities of response makes it a powerful improvisatory instrument for Strother. It equips his mind with a flexible tool for experimental exploration as he acts on the world by testing the model the painting provides. Strother feels equanimity, pleasure, even joy, as long as his predictions continue to be confirmed and allow improvisatory elaboration, until, of course, they do not. And he saw something that gave him a sharper arrest. James then signals this perceptual interruption with a chapter break, which is followed by, in turn, by the famous slow-motion rendering of Strother's realization that Chad and Madame de Villeneuve are also taking an afternoon together in the countryside. The bewilderment Strother experiences is what predictive processing theory calls surprisal, the distressing feeling of uncertainty and confusion prompted by unexpected events that signal errors in our models, disjunctions that release free energy. That is, in Mark Solm's words, the difference between the way the world is modeled by a system and the way the world actually behaves, end quote. This energy threatens entropy, organization falling apart, order collapsing into disarray, and must be rebound into patterns that incorporate the error signals into models that minimize disruption. Suddenly, Strother's consciousness shifts from leisurely rambling and imagining to intense projective activity over the course of several hours until he can rest again at the end of the chapter in the recognition of, quote, the deep, deep truth of the intimacy revealed. Intimacy, at such a point, was like that. This is one of the great examples in James's cognitive canon of the extraordinary epistemological power of seemingly small perceptual anomalies, the implication of Chad's gray hair when Strother first meets him in the theater, or of Isabel Archer happening upon Madame Merle standing while Osmond sits, or of the mutual look that the Prince and Charlotte exchange when Maggie surprises them after their return from Matcham. These seemingly minor anomalies can set off major prolonged cognitive readjustments because cognition is a process of testing predictive models, of experimenting with their ability to assimilate novel signals into configurations that organize the world. The free energy released when errors and uncertainties threaten entropic disarray then fuels aroused hypothesis testing and intense reflective activity to restore cognitive order and restore a new model. The restlessness of Isabel sitting up all night in her famous midnight vigil, for example, or Maggie intently circling the pagoda that figures the foursomes arrangement in the Golden Bowl and wondering what's behind its shiny surface. The drama of embodied and active cognition for James is especially acute and alive when the configurative activity of consciousness is challenged to convert the bewilderment prompted by anomalies into more effective, predictive models of the world. This is the activity of handling, criticizing, deriding, and playing with the world through which consciousness exercises its power to organize and reorganize experience. The doubling powers of consciousness that allow it to reach beyond the laboratory brain are at work here in the intertwining of temporality and intersubjectivity. Our sense that we share time with others is integral to the lived experience of intersubjectivity, even as our inability to fathom someone else's passing moment is evidence of the solipsism we can never completely overcome because we cannot know what it is like to inhabit another embodied consciousness with its own perspective on the world. How the paradoxes of time interact with the paradoxes of our relations with others is a cognitive topic that fascinates James, and it takes different shapes before and after Strother's epistemological shock on the river. Before, though he had been alone all day, he had never so struck himself as engaged with others and in the midstream of his drama, end quote. Because consciousness is double and split, Strother is with others in his memories and imagination, even as they're absent, their presence persisting in simulations that play with their absences by modeling their interactions in his recollections and reflections. The dramatization of his awakening is similarly double, intersubjectively and temporally, as he ponders what Chad and Madame Vianney are thinking in their shared experience of the present crisis. Will they snub him and pretend not to have seen him? What's going through their minds as they collaborate in the elaborate charade they perform during their return to Paris? He's in the moment with them in their shared shock and confusion, even as he reflects back on what it all means later on his bedroom sofa. James renders this intersubjective and temporal doubleness by representing the present moment through Strother's recollections. He was afterwards to remember. Strother was to remember afterwards further. He was to remember further still. This temporal double vision plays with the doubleness of their shared but different consciousnesses as they keep up the lie and the charming affair that Strother is coming to see through. This ability of consciousness to negate and go beyond the moment temporally and intersubjectively allows Strother to reach beyond the horizons of the moment and the boundaries of his private thoughts and feelings, and this doubleness is enacted in the reimagining and rebinding that follows the shock of the anomalous encounter. This interlocking of horizons is also what allows works of art and other cultural objects to connect subjectivities across historical distance. The paradoxes, problems, and possibilities characterizing this process is the topic of James's curious story, The Altar of the Dead. The altar is an aesthetic object that George Stransom creates for his personal purposes by improvising new uses for neglected shrines, affordances, lighting candles to commemorate dead acquaintances in a strangely private, secular reappropriation of customary religious practices. And I quote, "Each of his lights had a name for him, and from time to time a new light was kindled. He found the years of his life there, and the ties, the affections, the struggles, the submissions, the conquests, if there had been such, a record of that adventurous journey in which the beginnings and the endings of human relations are the lettered milestones. To other imaginations they might stand for other things. That they should stand for something to be hushed before was all he desired, but he was intensely conscious of the personal note of each and of the distinguishable way it contributed to the concert. There were hours at which he almost caught himself wishing that certain of his friends would now die, that he might establish with them in this manner a connection more charming than, as it happened, it was possible to enjoy with them in life. What the candles stand for is indeterminate, a gap that can be filled differently by other observers, and this openness to interpretation is what allows Stransom the possibility of repurposing the altar for his own ends. Similarly, the virtual dimension of a literary work, how it can be interpreted differently over the history of its reception, is what affords it the possibility of living on in the minds of readers long after the originating consciousness of the author is dead. The problems with Stransom's project, however, are exposed when it turns out that another worshipper uses his altar to commemorate his archenemy, Acton Hague. For Acton Hague, no flame could ever rise on any altar of his, Stransom had thought, but that is a use that it nevertheless affords to a different observer, and they could not exclude. Stransom seems to welcome different readings of his candles, but his project is oddly, even macabrely, lacking in humility. The candles are more about registering his adventurous journey than preserving the lives of his friends, who are reduced to lettered milestones that he counts off in the strangely impersonal process of numbering them and naming them in the silent roll call of his dead as he notes their places in his shrine. Strother's altar is an exercise of personal will, an attempt to control death by creating a formal structure that is curiously lifeless, more a testimony to his powers than a means for preserving his friends' memories. That this is a quest for a personal apotheosis is further suggested by his strange wish that his still living friends might contribute to it by hurrying up and dying. Even when he observes another worshiper at the altar, her worship aggrandizes him. She used his altar for her purpose. He can only hope that, sad and solitary as she always struck him, she used it for her own dead. And he ended by taking pleasure in the thought that he had given her almost the contentment he'd given himself. Almost? What an ungenerous response. If there can be life after death by living more and more in one's consciousness, as James proposes, this self-important vanity is not the way to go about it. Forgiveness for a past wrong is an act of generosity that reaches across temporal and intersubjective distance. But revenge and resentment are also ways in which the past lives on. Neither forgiveness nor revenge is prescribed by our neurobiology. Our cognitive powers afford both possibilities. The altar of the dead suggests that revenge is a dead end, however, because the personal apotheosis that rivalry and resentment seek is a self-contradictory project. The story ends with Stransom's dying words, his request to add one more candle to his altar. Yes, one more, he repeated, simply, just one. This is not a plea Stransom can answer by himself, through his own agency, any more than writers can guarantee that they will be read in the future or prescribe how their meanings will be preserved. As Gadamer explains, the one thing authors can be sure of is that they will be understood differently than they understand themselves, if they are understood at all. Even Harold Bloom's strong poets, who misread each other to assert their own priority in a Nietzschean battle for ascendancy, will survive only if they're read in ways that they cannot fully predict. That is not something that Stransom appreciates, but until it's too late. But James does. He knows that he will survive only if his art makes possible collaborative interaction that goes beyond what he himself can determine and control. If James lives on after death, it's not by becoming monumentalized as the master of autonomous literary form, before whose altar we should bow down in deference to his ascendancy. More paradoxical than this, James's mastery is an exercise of power that depends for its effects on the power of the reader to respond to its requirements and to transform them into occasions for creative meaning-making and critical reflection. As he explains in his preface to Wings of the Dove, attention of perusal is what I at every point absolutely invoke and take for granted, end quote. Reading James is indeed demanding, and even the most expert, experienced readers are not always up to what his writing asks of us. But its requirements are not ungenerous. The challenges of James's late style call on the reader to collaborate with him in extended acts of participatory sense-making. James does not play zero-sum games intended to enhance his standing at our expense, as in the vampire-like vision of how one person grows and expands by depleting another's power that is dramatized in the sacred fount. His demands, rather, are premised on the assumption of reciprocal trust between partners on which collaboration depends. The enjoyment of a work of art, he writes, the acceptance of an irresistible illusion, constituting, in my sense, our highest experience of luxury. The luxury is not greatest, by my consequent measure, when the work asks for as little attention as possible. It is greatest, it is delightfully, divinely great, when we feel the surface, like the thick ice of the skater's pond, bear, without cracking, the strongest pressure we throw on it. The sound of the crack one may recognize, but never surely to call it a luxury, end quote. This image suggests the risk and the danger of reading, our implicit trust that the text will reward the efforts it requires of us, a confidence that it is the writer's obligation to meet and justify. We skating readers may slip and fall, as the Jamesian reader will inevitably do, but the ice won't break. The mastery of the late style is not a repository of secret meanings that, as in the figure in the carpet, we're defied to unlock. Its resistance to our puzzle-solving proof of the author's ascendancy. Rather, James's mastery is the promise of his texts that they will reward whatever pressure we put on them, because we can count on him as a reliable partner to reciprocate. It must be admitted, however, that James's experiments with representation push, test, and perhaps exceed the limits of what's possible for a reader. As the notorious controversies over the late style demonstrate, readers have at times wondered whether the sound they heard was themselves falling or the ice cracking. To some extent, at least, such responses are an understandable reaction to the cognitive impossibility of what James seems to be asking us to do. On the one hand, James embraces the aesthetic of realistic representation that encourages readers to immerse themselves in lifelike worlds by filling in gaps and building consistent patterns in order to create a mimetic illusion. Reading a novel, he declares, makes it appear to us for the time that we've lived another life, that we've had a miraculous enlargement of experience. In The Turn of the Screw, for example, he famously explains that, quote, "My values are positively all blanks," end quote. And he claims that by refusing to specify the danger the children face, the reader's imagination will fill this in more effectively. And again, I quote James, "Only make the reader's general vision of evil intense enough," I said to myself, "and that already is a charming job. And his own experience, his own imagination, his own sympathy with the children, and horror of their false friends will supply him quite sufficiently with all the particulars," end quote. Filling the unsaid for themselves will, James argues, provide readers with the most powerful, immersive experience. On the other hand, however, James proliferates gaps and absences beyond what immersion in a realistic illusion requires through his well-known strategy of indirect representation, what he describes in the preface to The Golden Bowl as, quote, "the still marked inveteracy of a certain indirect and oblique view of my presented action, which provides not my own impersonal account of the affair in hand, but my account of somebody's impression of it, including the terms of this person's access to it and estimate of it," end quote. We're consequently asked to engage in a doubled process of seeing what a character sees, even as we observe, criticize, and judge how they see it, participating vicariously in Struthers' shock and confusion, for example, on encountering Chad and Madame de Villeneuve in the country, even as we watch him reflecting retrospectively on what this revelation means and evaluate his response to his many erroneous suppositions. We fill in the blank he wonders about. What are the guilty party thinking as they improvise a response, even as we simultaneously witness and judge his bemused, if disappointed, recognition of his naivete, a realization we as readers may well have anticipated. The doubled act of reading in this way asks us to engage in epistemological processes that we're simultaneously asked to observe and evaluate. Oscillating between such doubled acts of attention can seem pleasurable and expansive, a playful to and fro activity that affords more possibilities of response than a straightforward rendering would, or it can seem frustrating if observation interferes with immersion and involvement. This doubleness, immersing ourselves in an illusion while we observe it and reflect on how it was constructed, recalls those ambiguous figures like the rabbit-duck image, where we go back and forth between seeing a rabbit or a duck, even as we may take notice of the ambiguous gestalt that supports this to and fro activity. Just as cognitive processes that are invisible when they work smoothly come into view when they break down, so these moments of interruption and jamming can be enlightening and even amusingly disorienting, but an understandable reaction to such a breakdown may also be a wish to get the instrument working again, to restore comprehension and rebuild the illusion that has been momentarily broken. The late style is a way of modeling the world that is hyper-aware of the modeling activity it dramatizes and of its own aesthetic modeling. It is what Alva Noe calls a strange tool, a way of organizing experience that calls attention to its own organizing activity and to our activity as we use it. These are cognitive and aesthetic complications that David Lodge misses in his otherwise perceptive observation that James's dramatization of consciousness conveys what it is like to be conscious, what cognitive scientists call its qualia, more effectively than neuroscience can. After the cognitive scientist in Lodge's novel called Thinks, after the cognitive scientist explains the problem of consciousness, that is, how to give an objective third-person account of a subjective first-person phenomenon, the other lead character, who not coincidentally happens to be a creative writer, replies, "Oh, but novelists have been doing that for the last 200 years. And as proof, she recites from memory the opening lines of Wings of the Dove. She waited, Kate Croy, for her father to come in, but he kept her unconscionably, and there were moments at which she showed herself in the glass over the mantel, a face positively pale with the irritation that had brought her to the point of going away without sight of him. It was at this point, however, that she remained, changing her place, moving from the shabby sofa to the armchair upholstered in a glazed cloth that gave at once, she'd tried it, the sense of the slippery and of the sticky. This is indeed a compelling rendering of Kate Croy's embodied and active conscious cognitive processes, how her bodily movements as she paces the room and touches the furniture express how she's feeling, the impatience and irritation that are what the moment is like for her. These feelings, no doubt, reactivate traces of similar experiences with her father, and in this room, embodied memories that are reenacted here through processes of simulation. These sentences, however, are not only vivid renderings of simulative processes of embodied cognition, they're also self-reflexive, fictional configurations that call attention to our activity as readers in filling in their absences and constructing the patterns they suggest. We're called on to fill in gaps and build patterns that configure the action as Kate paces impatiently, even as we're asked to observe and reflect about her cognitive activity, and, even more, to appreciate this text strategy of indirect mediated specification that renders an event through the perceptual processes that constituting it. Responding to what these sentences afford, improvising to fill in what they leave unsaid, building patterns that make sense of implied relationships, imagining what lies beyond the scene's temporal horizons, past and future. These acts of collaborative meaning-making are a high-wire act, always endangered by the risk of a collapse into obscurity and confusion. When meaning breaks down, we may be motivated to work all the harder to combat entropy and restore sense, or we may be prompted to think about cognitive processes we ordinarily don't notice, but that have been exposed by being interrupted, much as we don't pay attention to how the hammer works as long as we're hitting the nail. Or we may wonder about a style of writing that plays off these cognitive processes against each other and asks us as readers to do so many things at the same time. Any and all of these responses are possible, and all have been recorded in the James criticism. Predictive processing theorist Andy Clark calls the testing of our cognitive models against the threat of error signals a process of surfing uncertainty, an ongoing attempt to generate and sustain and revise cognitive patterns and prevent the lapse into nonsense and noise that threatens when our models of the world don't effectively anticipate the signals we receive. Reading the late James is an analogous experience of surfing uncertainty as we ride the wave of meaning making responsively or momentarily lose our balance and collapse into confusion if we fail to make a connection or feel an implication elude our grasp. No one can provide all the time the attention James requires in the sustained manner that he demands. Something is always left out or hovers on the horizon of sense. But the feeling of emergent meaning as we rise to James's demands and fill in what is absent and unsaid can also be enlivening and arousing. Surfing uncertainty, affording us the chance to collaborate with him in risky, arousing acts of improvisatory meaning-making, is how James affirms that there is a life after death as we live on together, writers and readers, beyond the laboratory brain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Armstrong, for such an exciting lecture. We have lots of things to think about. So I believe we are going to have an excellent conversation now. I had many questions. I had to formulate them, but I think it's at this point it's better to open to the audience. I just will make one question to break the ice. So, okay.
Ice is breaking.
Okay. All right. I will put my glasses on. It's challenging for me, the glasses thing. So in the books you published in the 1980s, The Phenomenology of Henry James and The Challenge of Bewilderment, which, by the way, were very, very important for my own research on James, you engage deeply with German phenomenology. And in today's lecture, however, the theoretical framework you draw on comes from neuroscience. I was hearing you talk about the paradox involving consciousness in its relation to the brain on the one hand, and its capacity to reach beyond the individual's body and even beyond the individual's biological temporality. And I'd like to ask you, how do you reconcile a philosophical tradition like phenomenology, which, although critical of German idealism, still maintains a strong connection with it and to the idea of Geist, with neuroscientific research which grounds consciousness in the biological brain? So how do you link these two traditions?
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's a wonderful question. And it's a question that I explore in both of the books that you mentioned in the introduction, how literature plays with the brain and stories in the brain. But I'm not alone. I'm joining up in a tradition of neurophenomenology that Alvin Noe, whom I quote here, and Evan Thompson, who I also quote, are participants in. And they go back to the work of someone named Francisco Varela, a Chilean neuroscientist and a philosopher, who saw convergences between the way that Husserl describes consciousness. Particularly, Varela has a wonderful essay on Husserl's lectures on internal time consciousness and the horizons of the perceptual moment. It's the way that every perceptual moment has the past implicit in his retentional horizon and the future present in his protensional horizon, a doubleness that's crucial for the current work I'm suggesting, working on now. And Varela suggests that there can be mutually informative correlations for neuroscience between the kinds of descriptions that Husserl makes of consciousness and what the neuroscientists are finding in the laboratories. Now, this is not a solution to the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which Lodge refers to, which is how does consciousness arise from the activity of the brain. There's an explanatory gap, as the neurophenomenologists say, between what's going on in our neurons firing and our experience of what it's like to be conscious. But Varela and Thompson and Noe and others say, well, that gap can actually be productive if you look at correlations, you know. Mind the gap, you know. When there's a gap, there can always be conversation, dialogue, and it doesn't reduce phenomenology to neuroscience or science to phenomenology, but it gives the possibility of mutually informative conversations across that gap where the models of phenomenological description of experience can inform what the neuroscientists are finding, even as the neuroscientists can find in those phenomenological models ways of explaining what they're up to. And 4E cognition has, I think, helped to make those conversations more frequent and more productive. Merleau-Ponty, whom I referred to in one slide, in the slide on temporality and intersubjectivity, is a crucial figure in this. And he, you know, his theories of his work, phenomenology of perception, is often referred to by the neurophenomenologists. But another figure who's crucial in all this is William James. And you know, you asked about my earlier work, the phenomenology of Henry James and the challenge of bewilderment. And as I explained to you the other night at dinner, my earlier work, those two books that came out in the 1980s, started in an oral report in graduate school and seminar on Henry James that I took, where I tried in 15 minutes to explain the relationship between Henry James's art, William James's philosophy, and psychology. And I didn't do it in 15 minutes, and I've spent 50 years trying to do it ever since then. But James himself, Henry James, said to his brother, and, you know, although his brother didn't like, you know, his works, his novels, Henry said that he'd always felt that he'd unconsciously pragmatized in his life and work. And I think that's because of the ways in which James is really interested as some of the same things as his brother William is, like, you know, hypothesis testing, habit formation, the various sorts of things that I think the connections that the neurophenomenologists are making between phenomenology of consciousness and bodily processes in the brain and our bodies, continue to help to elucidate. So in some sense, the work I'm doing now is a continuation and expansion of the work I was doing then. And you may have heard echoes in this. I frequently choose the words challenge and bewilderment. You know, they're there. You know, they're and the temporal double vision I talk about in the challenge of bewilderment, but can connect it now to things that are going on in neuroscience. So the project continues, and I think I've been helped by the neurophenomenologists in being able to see the connections that I was actually intuiting already back in the early 1970s in graduate school.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It's interesting that William used it to get provoked by James' late style. Right. So he got irritated by it. But it's the style that matches with his psychology most.
Very much so. Very much so. And I intuited that back in the phenomenology of Henry James. That was, the connections I was making there between what William talks about, what he calls fringes, the horizons of the moment, and what I talked in the phenomenology of Henry James in the second chapter on the art of fiction, the teleology of the impression, how Henry James thinks that what he calls the impression that one feels is sort of future looking. Okay. There's a wonderful story in that essay, The Art of Fiction, that I draw on, where he talks about a woman, a novelist friend of his, Anne Thackeray Ritchie was her name, a woman of genius. He said, walked past an open doorway and saw around a table a French Protestant family with their children having dinner. And that moment was, James says, well, how did she wrote a novel on French Protestant youth. How did she know all that? It was that moment, because that impression had within it the teleology, the sense of future, that she could see across the horizons, because she knew what it was to be Protestant, she knew what it was to be young, she knew what it was to be French. But she could, one of these people, he says, it's a wonderful essay, she, when she gave her, I'm not misquoting him, but you give her an inch and she takes a mile, give her an L and she takes, kilometers, because she was someone who could chart the unseen from the seen, and chart the implication of things, and that sense of horizonality is still something that I think the predictive processing theory is catching up on. That I'm thinking about even now.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So, the audience, do you like to make some questions to Professor Armstrong? Yeah? Marcelo?
Okay. Okay. So I'll try to be quick. Okay. So thank you so much for your very interesting talk. I'm still processing it, but I was wondering some things. That going back to the ambassadors and that passage of the Lambinet, and I was thinking also, as you were saying, that, well, referring back to James, art makes life, and also perhaps, if I understood it well, make us help us create patterns and test them as well. But in that particular passage, for me at least, it made Strater be wrong, in a sense. Right. Yes, it's like when he saw Madame de Vionnet in Chad, it was like a shock of reality. Right. That he wasn't anticipating, and maybe he was under the illusion created by the art of Lambinet, perhaps. And then I also thought, if those models that you're talking about, and they can be perhaps not, well, derived from James' fictions, if they are also historically constructed. For instance, that kind of patterns, those kind of patterns that James envisioned were not because he was living that specific time and historical moment, and or if not, the things about the brain are like always like that. Or not. They are historical. They can be retraced by history in that sense. The later part of the 19th century, when he wrote the Americans, the ambassadors, or the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah, just like yes, that passage of time. I don't know if I was clear about that.
Very wonderful question, and I think we agree. I think your question sort of is teasing out a number of the things that I'm thinking about in this about how James is fascinated with how we know by forming patterns, how we know by projecting hypotheses, how we know by composing the world, and we're not aware that we do that most of the time when it works. We notice it when it breaks down. We notice it when things don't fit. Who are those people out there on the river? It's Chad. It's Madame Divanet. Or Isabel Archer comes home and she sees her good friend Madame Merle and her awful husband Osmond talking, but Madame Merle is standing and Osmond is sitting. That's anomalous. Wait. And that she needs to refigure all that she'd assumed about their relationship, because it suggests that there's a kind of intimacy that she then later unravels, and I can go on. But James is not Emersonian in thinking that consciousness just arises out of our transcendental sphere. He's very much historical, and these patterns come from past experiences. Isabel Archer says to Madame Merle, I don't, the clothes I wear certainly don't define who I am. I'm not defined by conventions, and Madame Merle says, would you prefer to go without them? I mean, James always thinks that, we can know what we can know and don't know is formed by our conventions, our historical patterns, the stories we tell, the works of art we've seen, but they're not the last word. They afford various possibilities. That's why I think Gibson is so useful. They allow certain kinds of improvisation that's unpredictable, or they can go wrong, and when they go wrong, we notice them and we can change our minds. Strother, wonderfully in The Ambassadors, realizes that he was wrong, that it was not a virtuous attachment. Because what are they doing out in the countryside? She goes back to London. She doesn't have a shawl. It's obviously in the hotel room they've been sharing. But he doesn't then reject his interpretation entirely, because he sees virtues in the attachment that Chad's sister, Sarah Pocock, and Mrs. Newsom back in Woolett don't see. So he revises his interpretation. He can't know anywhere else and do anything else. The mind is not, for Henry James's view, or for neuroscience, just a mirror that you polish up. The mind is a set of hypotheses and patterns that we then need to reorganize, and there's kind of the connection to the predictive processing theories that Strother does. And he ends The Ambassadors by affirming that there are indeed virtues in the attachment, but differently than he'd seen before, because he does that active revision. So how history gives us patterns that are open to interpretation, open to improvisation and creative reworking is, I think, something that James is very much interested in his works. And I think that how his novels offer us that sort of opportunity as well as we participate in the history of perception. He intuits that, and that's what I'm trying to work out.
Natasha, do you want?
I have 4 questions here.
Oh my goodness.
Perhaps I should contain myself and make one question, and then there is another one from the online audience as well. So thank you, Professor, for your very intriguing talk. I admire your work, and I love Stories in the Brain.
Thank you.
And in it, you discuss the paradox of time in modern fiction. You argue that there is coordination, there is temporal coordination among the lives of the characters, but at the same time there is disjunction, there is disconnection. And I was thinking, how do you see this temporal paradox in modern fiction, and how does it offer a journey that is different from others? Like, is there something special in the modernist time travel that differs from other fictions, like realist fiction?
Wonderful question. It was really lovely to come to a conference that's on realism and modernism, because my work on Henry James and also on Joseph Conrad and Ford Maddox, 4 people I talk about in The Challenge of Bewilderment, but also in Stories in the Brain, I talk about in temporality, Joyce's Ulysses, Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, and To the Lighthouse and the Waves. But I think of James as the last realist and the first modernist, because he both wants to have us immerse ourselves in an illusion, as he calls attention to the ways in which consciousness makes up the world that become increasingly the focus of modernist writers, wondering, what is it about, what is it about, consciousness that becomes the drama of consciousness. And part of it for modern writers is, the peculiarity of temporality, that in realism, writers like Balzac, whom Henry James loved, have aspects merged together coherently. So you get a sense in the perspectives blending with beginnings and middles and ends, merging. You can immerse yourself in an illusion and have a lifelike sense of happening, because this is the way in which we have a sense of perspectives blending in our temporal experience of the world, and it's sort of recreated in the unfolding of aspects in realism. Those aspects are interrupted in modernism, in order to call attention to the way in which we know the world through aspects, and the temporality of the games with temporality are a way of showing how much consciousness is predictive. Ford Maddox Ford, who very much admired James, said he collaborated with Conrad and said that he and Conrad felt that life doesn't narrate. It makes impressions on our brains. So we shouldn't narrate. We should render impressions, which means disrupting chronology, all sorts of time shifts and back and forth that don't have the story go straight forward, because it said life doesn't go straight forward. And I could go on and make the answer shorter, but I think in Ulysses and in Woolf's works and Sound and the Fury, Faulkner, the disruption of temporality, creating what Joseph Frank called spatial form, is actually an attempt to call attention to the ways that temporality works in making consciousness, in the way that we make up the world. And it's again the strange tool business. We don't notice that when it's working, but the modernists are disrupting temporality in order to call attention to it. And I think that the two sides of James that I was talking about, the realist and the one who wants us to sort of reflect about the modeling activity as he himself is conscious of those. He's on the pivot point between realism and modernism there.
Thank you very much, Professor. The second question here, it's from Larissa, and then she asks, you mentioned surfing uncertainty as a common experience when reading Henry James. What advice would you offer to new readers who wish to engage with his fiction, but may feel discouraged by its complexity?
Right. Now, I'm not a surfer, but I imagine that you want to start out with small waves. You don't want to go. You don't want to. And James himself, when he was asked, readers said he said start with some of the small potatoes and then work up to the more to the more ambitious works. Actually, a friend of mine who I said I'm coming to Brazil, and she said, "Oh, I want to talk about Henry James." She said, "Well, I pick up a book of his to read." And I saw her next. She said, "We're starting to read The Golden Bowl." And I said, "Don't start there. No." And suggested that she start instead with Portrait of a Lady. And when I teach James in my seminars, I sort of start with the realist and try to draw them through in seeing how the realist becomes more and more fascinated with the processes of consciousness that are his characters and our ways of knowing the world, how that emerges. And so I'd start with Portrait of a Lady, which is one of my favorite books, a really wonderful book. But then ask why he writes chapter 42, which she spends all night thinking. Why would that be so important? Why just not drop it out? It was because that's where she's aroused by trying to do this process, do this work of reconfiguring her world and reconstructing by responding to the anomalies that she saw. Doesn't conclude anything by the end of the chapter, but her thinking is itself the drama. And then, being able to appreciate that then can lead you through James's later works to being able to work yourself up to the Ambassadors and The Golden Bowl. I still can't. I've just been rereading The Wings of the Dove for the third time. That's the ice cracks for me there. Another just quickly piece of advice: start with Portrait of a Lady, and then the works of the 1890s are really crucial for James, because it's in the works of the 1890s when he's making this shift and experimenting with smaller works where he's trying to think about how he would do this double work of representing a world and representing the way that a consciousness knows the world. And actually, when I teach James, I start with what Maisie knew in, I think, 1897, in the late 1890s, which students can actually very much identify with, because he's trying there, as he says in the preface, to show how this little girl knows much more than she really understands, even as she doesn't really fully make sense of what's going on. And the lovely appreciative irony of the book is him trying to have us really sympathize with how she's trying to make sense of a bewildering landscape where she can't trust the people around her, even with all of her goodwill, trying to see how she could possibly collaborate and contribute to making more value in this world. And students can identify with this for all sorts of reasons. It's a very contemporary text. But it's also a text where this double business of trying to represent what's going on, as conventions of marriage are falling apart, children can no longer count on the world behaving as they previously have exposed sorts of epistemological processes, psychological processes, moral processes that are otherwise invisible. Students can really identify with this in a way that allows them then to see the techniques and appreciate the techniques so that they can then go on. And in my seminar, we end with a golden bowl. You know, I tell students, you know, this is going to be probably more than you can handle, the golden bowl, and by the end of the semester, it's their favorite book. For that reason.
Wow.
Yeah.
My students is still bewildered by the portrait of a lady. I don't think they can read the Golden Bowl yet, but
The portrait of a lady is wonderful.
yeah, it is. So, Thaís e Thiago.
So hello, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. Loved it. And actually, my question is related to the parallels you drew between painting and a novel, which was fascinating, by the way. So you said that painting was a sort of mental time travel device. And I was wondering, how do you conceive Impressionist painting as ways of constructing subjectivities and temporalities? As you know, that this was an art movement that broke precisely with this idea of art being a mirror of reality, right? And how James drew on these sources, on this aesthetic, to create subjectivists and temporalities. So I'm curious to hear you on that.
Wonderful question, thank you. As Lisa knows, when she visited me and Brown a dozen or so years ago, I taught a course on literary impressionism that, where we talked about the painting, and I think there's a parallel movement in visual arts. It's not my area of expertise, but I think there's a parallel movement in visual arts from Impressionism and Monet to Post-Impressionism and Cézanne to Modernism that is analogous to what's happening with the novel. And when James talks about the impression, he doesn't mean the same thing as the Impressionists do. James is more interested in how consciousness composes rather than trying to get to the so-called innocent eye, as Ruskin talked it. But Ford Madox Ford is interested in that, and Conrad's interested in that, and the various techniques of trying to, show bewildered characters before consciousness fully forms, and wonderful works of Ford's Impressionism do that. Virginia Woolf. Her friend Roger Fry, and the Post-Impressionist exhibition, crucial to her development of modernism. And I think you can chart very similarities going on with painting itself becoming the topic of painting and modernism, and the perspectives becoming themselves the topic, but in a different form. Part of why I turned to philosophy and have turned to neuroscience in order to be able to think about these things. It seems to me that there are useful tools there for being able to make epistemological distinctions that we can't easily make on our own if we're just taking a term like impression. It's very ambiguous and confusing, and trying to see, well, what does Ford Madox Ford mean by it? What does James mean by it? And it's not the same thing. Well, but if you look at their works and can use these tools for thinking about how, in Kierkegaard's terms, we live forward but understand backwards, and how the living forward is Jamesian impression composing consciousness. The understanding backwards is the confusion that Lord Jim feels at the beginning of Lord Jim, or that Dowell and the Good Soldier experiences. The tools of epistemological tools of philosophy and neuroscience can give us hermeneutic instruments, give instruments for thinking about distinctions in consciousness that these writers and painters were working with, and they're not philosophers. But their works provide wonderful laboratories for experimenting with these epistemological questions that we can do our work of interpreting better by using the scientific and philosophical tools in ways that may then inform the philosophers and the scientists, because you can't find everything you want to know about consciousness by putting somebody under an fMRI machine or putting me last night in a tomography device, But the novel is a laboratory that James and Conrad and Wolff and Faulkner are conducting amazing, wonderful experiments with, and painting Monet and Cézanne, Picasso are. And we can then use these tools in order to be able to tell the neuroscientists and the philosophers things that they can't tell from their own, with their own experimental instruments, things that that they should want to know. And the ambiguities of the impression and charting those two stories is a good example of that.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this hugely insightful talk. Could you please reflect on the emptying of a fact or emotion that James's narrative method seems to predicate? You stated that James's novels thwart immersion. Indeed, we as readers follow the enactment of consciousness, but the very reflexivity of such process ends up forestalling any sort of readerly identification with such consciousness, let alone vicarious experience. So in James's novels, the configuration of consciousness is first and foremost an intellectual or brainy affair, something that we may visualize or grasp with our mind's eye, but not actually feel. So, as a reader of 18th century novels, I'm always rather disoriented by James's rather intellectualized narrative method, because it certainly pushes us readers away from fully submerging into the subjectivity of characters. So consciousness, so there's this tendency to portray, to enact consciousness in a very complex manner, but consciousness is something that is enacted on our brain. We don't feel with characters. I would be very glad if you could reflect on that, on the emotional, on the emptying of emotion in James's novels.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think the way that I would begin to address it is to say that that's the kind of dilemma that the reader feels that I was trying to point to when I put up the rabbit duck figure.
Okay.
And talked about how James is asking us to do two things at the same time that contradict each other. Mm-hmm. Your question goes to the contradiction. He does want us to immerse ourselves in Lambert Strethers' dilemma. Mm-hmm. Live all you can, it's a mistake not to. He wants us to really emotionally feel with the excitement and of this 55-year-old fellow going to Paris and his the emotions that he feels. Mm-hmm. But in asking us then to think about how Strether has all of his categories taken by surprise by Paris, which is James's phrase, and how wants us to think about. He says Strether has the oddity of a double consciousness. Trying to think about that. How can you immerse yourself in the illusion while having the illusion? I mean, this is something that Gombrich says about the rabbit duck experience. He says, how there's a contradiction between having the illusion and reflecting about the illusion. And James wants to have it both ways. And I think that makes him more interesting, but I think it also can make him frustrating. The one thing I would push back a little bit on is the idea that there's a contradiction either in cognitive science or I think in James between emotion and consciousness. Because Mark Solms, whom I quote some in here, is in his wonderful book Hidden Springs of Consciousness, talks about how emotions are actually cognitive. There are ways of feeling the pull and the push of things. And consciousness arises out of our feelings for the world. So rather than being a Cartesian divide between emotions and thinking, or between the body and the mind, they are, they're intertwined with each other. And I have an essay coming out in a Rutledge anthology on contemplatory studies on the neuroscience of aesthetic emotions. And I argue there that one of the things that neuroscience shows is that you can see that there's a difference between hearing and seeing in the brain because there's a visual cortex and the auditory cortex. You can't disentangle feeling and consciousness. They're all intertwined in the brain and our bodily involvement in the world. And I think, for James, too, how feelings are parts of the ways in which his characters confusingly try to make sense of the world, but then reflect back on. But how you think about that while also representing that double task. And I mean, that's just also part of the difficulty of learning how to read James. And there are readers for whom this is fascinating. There are readers for whom this is frustrating. I mean, one of the books that I taught over the course of my career repeatedly was a course I called Realism and Modernism, from Balzac to Faulkner. And the first time I taught the course, I had students, really resist Woolf and Faulkner when they got to it because they wanted to be back in the world of Balzac. So then I started to actually switch things up, and actually began the course by having a realist and a modern. I would have them read Balzac's Pere Goriot, then I'll have them read Ford's The Good Soldier. Yeah. And, Ford's asking all these questions about how Dowell knows. He says, this is the saddest story I've ever heard. But he's telling the story. Yeah. But he's telling the story as he tries to discover it. And so this connection between emotions and thinking. And so pairing Ford and Balzac made the students think, okay, well, yeah, actually, in the novel, there are various sorts of things going on. Even Balzac is thinking about how structures of understanding work, as Rastignac tries to make sense of Paris and goes to the various balls where he doesn't know who's who and whatever, and makes all sorts of mistakes. Even for in Balzac, the anomalies are how Rastignac educates himself. And Henry James has, always loved Balzac. He has a wonderful essay on talk on the lesson of Balzac. But so I would agree and disagree, and hope you can learn to love James.
Admire his legacy.
The Golden Bowl. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask some? The last one.
Okay, a very quick one. Wonderful presentation, Paul. Apparently you didn't hit your head that hard. Yes. I would like to go back to your initial discussion with Luiza. Just a curiosity, actually. I'm not a James scholar, so would you say that his Henry James's literary style was perhaps inspired or by his brother's work in pragmatism, consciously inspired?
That's interesting. I don't think consciously inspired. I mean, it's always hard to tease things out. I mean, they read each other's works throughout their lives, and they were both the children of a very influential and powerful father, Henry James Sr. That if you want to find out about the relations between Henry James Sr. and the brothers, I recommend Beverly Haviland's work. Full disclosure, she's my wife. Maybe watching now. Hello, Beverly. So I think the relations, if I were to try to do the biography and the biographical, it would be to start with Henry James Sr. and the Transcendentalist circle that Henry James Sr. was part of, and show how William and Henry were both incorporating that but trying to move beyond it in ways that may parallel each other, may have influenced each other. I don't know for sure that Henry read pragmatism, but the chapter on habit is wonderful there and has all sorts of resonances with James's work. It was in response to pragmatism, the late work of Henry, in 1906 or thereabouts, that Henry said that, William, I found that I've unconsciously pragmatized my life and work, like this character in Voltaire who says he discovered he'd been speaking prose all his life without noticing it. And so I think that there are parallel strands. To what extent there's influence is hard to tease out, but I think it's mutually illuminating to ask the question.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we'll have to end this first conference. I'm sure everybody here became bewildered by your lecture, but in a very, very good way, an exciting way. So it's, a fantastic beginning for our conference. Thank you very much, Professor Armstrong. So we'll make a very small break, and we'll have our first table.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.